This is the DRF Players Podcast. Here are your hosts, Peter Thomas Fornatel and Jonathan Kinchin.
Hello and welcome to the DRF Players Podcast. This is show 392. We are recording this on December 10th, 2018, as we continue the march through the holidays and to show number 400. Can't believe we've been around that long. But in those 400 shows, if I'd made a list at the very beginning of guests that I wanted to have on the show, this name would have been on it. Somehow, its circumstances have conspired. It's taken us this long. My intro for this next guest could take up an awful long time, but I'll give the condensed version. He is an Eclipse Award winner. He's won the Eddie Arcaro Award, the Mike Venezia Award, the George Wolfe Award, in addition to his riding accomplishments, which include 4,450 winners. He's also a fantastic broadcaster and somebody, and this is something we'll get into over the course of this interview, not only sees things from the horseman perspective, but also the horse player / handicapper's perspective, as well as anybody. And we definitely want to talk about that. Welcome to the DRF Players Podcast, Richard Migliore. How are you today, my friend?
No, I'm doing well. Thanks for having me, and I appreciate the accolades. It's always nice to hear the things that have gone on in your past.
This is your life. We have a touch of this is your life going on here on the podcast today. Well, the first question I'm going to ask you is very simple. I definitely understand how an Italian-American from Brooklyn can get into horse racing broadcasting. That's a subject near and dear to my heart. I understand a little bit less intuitively how an Italian-American kid from Brooklyn ends up riding over 4,000 winners. I know you've told the story many times, but we have some younger listeners on the show, and I just wanted to get a little bit on your background in your own words on how this journey started for you.
Well, it's really interesting that it was because of Little League Baseball that I actually got led to horses. My dad always liked to bet on the races, going out to Aqueduct at different times as a kid. So I was exposed to racing, and I always liked it, and I loved going to Aqueduct. And the horses captured me, but also the pageantry, the silks, the whole atmosphere of the racetrack was always very intoxicating. But I was playing in Gil Hodges Little League off of McDonald Avenue in Brooklyn, and my Little League coach actually owned the pony ride concession at the Nellie Bly Amusement Park off the Belt Parkway.
That's great.
And, so I started working with ponies there, and then when I was 11, we moved out to Long Island and got a job at a farm because I was already comfortable with horses and ponies per se, and met kids that had ponies, got involved with pony racing, and one day a lady saw me win a pony race at an athletic field and said, you could be a jockey, and gave me a number of a guy who had a farm further out east that had a track, and they had thoroughbreds and quarter horses, because back then there was a quarter horse track out in Yaphank, Long Island. And I called the guy up, and he said, "Have you ever galloped a racehorse?" And I said, "Oh, of course I have," even though I'd never been on a racehorse. And so I was 12 years old. I started galloping racehorses at a farm out there. And, one thing led to another. And Steve DeMauro gave me my first job on the track when I was 14 years old at Belmont, and had papers that said I was 16. And by the time I was 16, I started riding professionally. And it was, just a tremendous adventure.
That is unbelievable. At what point, what was it that made you think you could emulate those riders that you had seen as a kid? I mean, is this just a case of you're young, you think you can do anything, or was there a particular moment that really galvanized the concept that you could compete against these people who you'd been admiring as a fan?
I think it was the 1976 Marlboro Cup, watching Shoemaker win on 4-Go, catching Honest Pleasure right on the money. Earlier in the day, I had won a pony race in similar fashion. The pony actually stumbled at the break in a 200-yard race and got up and won by a head. And I watched that, and I said, I just did that. I mean, obviously on a much lesser scale. And I remember sitting up in the tack room, because back then they had racing from Belmont, Aqueduct, Saratoga with Frank Wright and Charles C. Canty. And,
Sure.
Saturday, I was going to be in front of that TV watching that show. And I just told everybody that, I'm going to do that. I'm going to be just like Shoemaker. Now, flash forward 4 years later, I'm in Japan for the very first Japan Cup at 16 years old, rode the very one to a third-place finish. And, I could say it now. I mean, I'm 54. It's okay to say. First time I ever got drunk in my life was with Bill Shoemaker in Tokyo.
That is fantastic. What a surreal beginning of a career that must have been for you in so many ways. How were you received by other riders having a background that's pretty different from a lot of people who came up in the game either through the family connections, etc.? Did you feel like an outsider at that point?
I didn't feel like an outsider. My boss, Steve DeMauro, had really, really schooled me, and I had been with them, for almost 2.5 years. And by the time I rode, I was really ready to ride, and I had worked a lot of horses with a lot of different riders, like Eddie Maple comes to mind in particular, Nick Santagata. And I think I had already gained some respect because people saw how serious I was, how hard I worked. I mean, not only did we gallop horses all morning at Belmont, then we would go out to Mr. DeMauro's farm in Mill Neck and work all afternoon with horses at the farm. In between, I tried to continue to go to high school. I would take 3 buses to go to a split session high school out in Brentwood, Long Island, finish school at 5:30 in the evening, go home, eat, pass out, be up at 3:30 to get back to the track. So I think I had gained people's respect because they saw my work ethic. Of course, any young rider, regardless of their background, their upbringing, has to gain their respect in the room. And, I think I was able to do that pretty quickly. But again, a lot had to do with how well schooled I was and how I was taught to handle myself by Steve DeMauro.
Oh, that's great. You were a champion apprentice. How big of a transition is it from riding with the bug to becoming a journeyman in those early years? How did the job change for you?
Well, so many things changed. Just losing the bug was one thing. And, of course, there were a lot of stables back then, like Tresvant Stable comes to mind, that rode exclusively the bug. So if you were riding a bunch of horses for them, you were automatically losing that business. But at the same time, I had also bought my contract from Steve DeMauro. And there was so many things going on, and it was probably poor timing. I made some mistakes as a young guy, just feeling like I was a little bit smothered under the contract and probably didn't use the best judgment. But, you're 17 years old and, everything is a little bit magnified in your head, and probably would have been smarter to take a step back, breathe, think it through. So not only was I losing the bug, now I was basically a freelance journeyman as opposed to being under contract. So there were, a confluence of things that I think made it difficult. And I went really into a post-apprentice slump.
What got you out of that slump?
Hard work. Really good agent named Maurice Farias one day grabbed me and said, you really ride well, but I think, maybe you're just a little bit, you're working harder, not smarter. And he took my book, and we really got going again. And by the end of 84, so I was leading apprentice in 81, 82, and 83 were a little bit lean. 84, I was really hitting my stride. Got hooked up riding first call for Pete Ferriola, who was doing really, really well at the time, and that certainly helped. And then 85, I was leading rider again for the whole year in New York, and was riding some really high-profile horses. A New York bred named Wynn actually beat Cozine on the square, actually giving him 3 pounds into Bernard Baruch in a great race. I begged them to supplement for the Breeders' Cup Mile, and they, it was just too much money, and they didn't. So Cozine wins the Breeders' Cup on Saturday and sets the track record for a mile on the turf at Aqueduct at the time. And Wynn comes back the very next day, and they had like a consolation race, the Shergar, and he runs a mile and breaks Cozine's track record the very next day, carrying 128 pounds, and won for fun. So I always regretted that they couldn't supplement him, but certainly understood the economics of it. Was riding Eternal Prince, who I won the Gotham and the Wood Memorial, which was a big deal. because the Wood Memorial, for me going to the track with my dad, I would look at all those win pictures on the third floor of the Wood Memorial winners, and I'd go, man, imagine if I could be on that wall one day. And then I knew I was going to be there. And of course, the fairy tale came to an abrupt halt when he got left at the gate in the Derby and had a horrible trip. I don't think he was going to be able to outrun Spend a Buck under any circumstances, but I certainly got a lot of criticism for that ride, even though horses get left in the Derby and have tough trips all the time.
Yeah, it does seem like there are some trips for which you can at least talk about, hey, did the rider do something here? There are others where you it feels much more like you're just a victim of circumstance. I want to talk about that agent-rider relationship. I think it's something that's sometimes underappreciated by fans and by horse players, of just how much a good agent can mean. What percentage of that do you think has to do with just relationships that agent might bring to the table, and what percentage of it is having to do more with like race strategy? I'm just curious where, just to get a little deeper inside the agent-jockey relationship and why it can make such a big difference for riders.
Well, I think relationships are a huge part of being a good agent. My brother Michael works for Dylan Davis, and that's one thing I've always coached him to do: establish relationships. Have go-to guys that you can always lean on if things are a little bit tough or you're slumping. I was always a rider that had good relationships with certain trainers that, if I was coming back from an injury or I just was in a slump, and I can go to them and say, listen, I need to ride a winner. And they would put me on, basically a hang-on job. So you always, and you need those relationships. You need people that are going to kind of pull you up when you need, someone to give you that boost. I only had one agent my entire career that I ever discussed racing strategy with and talked to, and that was Steve Caceres, who's a trainer now. And he had been an assistant trainer to his brother, and then he took my book, and he was a tremendous agent, but he's also a tremendous student of the game. So I felt really comfortable going through a racing forum with Steve and saying, what do you think about this? I think this is the speed, but, where would I be? And he always talked to me about saving ground, the importance of saving ground, saving horse. So he was an agent that was a huge asset to me from a strategic standpoint. I've had other great agents. Ron Anderson was, a tremendous agent, and I'll probably, get phone calls that I left people out of this, but I was blessed that way. I was very hard on agents. I was not an easy rider to work for because I am a workaholic. I was usually the first guy at the track every morning and the last guy to leave to go to the jockey's room and lose weight and prepare to ride. But so I never asked an agent to do anything I wasn't going to do myself, but it was hard for me to find somebody who could keep up with my work ethic and my energy. And I really would be hard on guys if I didn't feel like they were putting into it as much as I was. Considering that a jockey pays an agent 25%, I don't think that's too much to ask for.
No, it's completely reasonable, but you could also see how it could create tension in certain circumstances as well. You talked about learning to not just work hard, but work smarter. In jockey terms, what does that mean?
Well, it's one thing that I probably never fully grasped my entire career, and looking back on it, it's easy to see it. I grew up on the racetrack. From the time I was 14 years old, I lived on the backstretch for better than 2 years. Those people were friends and family to me. So I could be leading rider and go into the track kitchen, and a guy who has 3 horses and not very good horses would say to me, hey, Meg, I got this filly and she had a tough trip, last time she ran. Would you ride her for me? And I could never say no. And then I'd wind up on a horse that, probably wasn't, first of all, it was going to make a difference in my career, but probably wasn't the smartest to keep myself healthy. And, getting hurt on the cusp of big races. And again, on horses, looking back on it, that maybe I shouldn't have put myself in a position to even be on. And I would even have agents say, do you really want to ride this, $20,000 maiden, and the guy says she's doing good. He really needs to win a race or, get a check. And, had one fall on top of me right before the Breeders' Cup and, break my pelvis and my arm. And, so it's easy to look back, but also I think maybe that's who I was, and people respected that, and maybe I wouldn't have had the success if people didn't see how much I really cared, because I wanted to win a 10-claimer as bad as I did a grade 1, and I think that people respected that in me.
Most definitely. That work ethic is something that, just as a fan watching you could see it. You could see the way you'd ride out for the minors in a way that other jockeys wouldn't. And I think it's always endeared you to not just fans of horse racing, but specifically bettors, that you always knew you were going to get your all when you were in the saddle. And it sounds like that was something that was very conscious.
I was really conscious of that, and the fact that like growing up in Brooklyn and going to the races and the guys in the neighborhood, the worst thing a jockey could be, and this was their terminology, not mine, was a mutt. Like if a guy didn't ride out and lost third, and a guy missed the try because that mutt didn't wasn't on his belly. And I was always in my heart a bit of a Brooklyn kid, and I never wanted anybody to accuse me of not giving my all. And also then, the factor is, checks mean a lot to people trying to pay the bills, especially a smaller trainer. So, I really always was very conscious of that.
It is hard, though, because there's a balance, especially as you start riding better horses. There are horsemen who are not going to want to see their horse hit an extra time or whatever to finish fourth in a race. And some famous instances where certain owners will get very angry at riders for using the whip at all. How do you, as the athlete up there, try to balance the needs of the horseman and the connections with the needs of the bettor?
Yeah, it's such an interesting question, and it's a great opportunity, and a lot of it is education. To the horse player, to the fan, to the owners, the trainers, and obviously young riders. Now, when I first started, I felt like I was very, very connected to the horses, and I really understood when a horse was giving me his best, and when it was time to put the stick away, or when a horse wasn't giving you his all and you needed to kind of demand it. But in the middle of my career, I really got lost with that. It all became about just winning, and I'm not even like, I had great success, but I'm not really proud of that period of my career where the horse became a vehicle to get to the winner's circle or to get what I wanted. And then the last probably 8 years of my career, it had come full circle, where I was that horseman again. And I wasn't going to go to the whip because I thought somebody needed to see that, to know that I was trying. So I think that it's about educating people. It's not the rider that hits the most or the hardest that's, going to get the most out of a particular horse. I think the whip gets guys in trouble or gets them beat more times than it doesn't. But again, it's hard to get lost when you're in the midst of it, trying so hard to prove that you belong in a certain spot. And frankly, I think even though if you really look at my stats, they're a little more white collar, I definitely had a reputation of being a bit more of a blue collar rider, because I was the guy, again, going to give everything I could on that 10-claimer or whatever it was. But it's interesting how guys and Mike Smith has done this unbelievably. His balance to be able to say, no, you know what, I'm at a certain age, I'm not going to ride certain horses. He's in demand for the right kind of horses, where he managed his career. Jerry Bailey, and these are great riders. I'm not belittling their abilities, but they managed their careers. They would take a step back from certain kind of horses, particularly coming to the Triple Crown or the Breeders' Cup, unless it was for clients. And it kind of made them have people had a different view of them, because, well, no, Jerry's not going to ride that 10-claimer, or Mike's not going to ride this kind of horse. And I applaud them. They were able to pull off that balance. I never really was able to find that. But again, that's kind of who I am.
I wasn't planning on talking about whip rules, but I think it's come up so organically. And it's something that I believe in 2018 it's a giant marketing challenge for racing that I think people within the game, and a lot of people who grew up in the game, don't even realize the negative marketing impact it has when you're talking about trying to get people to pay attention to racing who know nothing about racing and haven't grown up in any kind of agricultural background. Because of that, as much as anything else, I believe that it is appropriate to regulate whip rules much more strictly. I mean, obviously they're not really regulated at all here, but I think it's something that could really help the game in ways that people aren't necessarily even thinking of, really on that marketing side. As a former rider, do you bristle at that idea?
No, I don't bristle at it at all. I think the culture has changed so much, and if you go back to the early '80s when I started riding, if you didn't hit one hard and almost and again I cringe saying it, but this is the reality of the culture then, or raise a well, then you weren't considered strong, and people learned and realized, first of all, that's cruel. Second of all, it doesn't really get the desired effect. And I definitely understand the optics. People see, wow, why are they beating that horse? Now, I'm not one of these people that thinks that you have to take whips away from riders. In fact, I think that would create more dangerous situations. And I'm not saying you steer a horse with a whip, but if you think about the basics of riding, most riders ride with long stirrups and they have their leg aid. There's different aids. You have your hands, your voice, your leg. A jockey already gives up his leg aid, so it's a little harder to guide a horse without being able to put your leg on the side of him and help use your weight to steer them in a certain direction. Now you take away another aid, which would be the crop, and I think you're inhibiting a rider's ability to control a horse the way you need to. Now, that being said, I can't take it when I see a guy in front by 5 whipping on a horse, or conversely, if a horse is backing up through the field, obviously has nothing to give, and a guy is just pounding away. I think that's when the stewards have to use common sense and be very, very strict and severe in the punishment of saying, you weren't urging that horse with the whip. You were abusing that horse. It should not be a punishment. It's supposed to be an aid, not a punishment. Mm-hmm. And I think that's where it starts. I'm not big about, certain horses have short attention spans. So I'm not big about, well, you can only hit a horse 4 times. And what is hitting a horse? Tap him on the shoulder to keep him going forward? Like I always thought George Chavez, had such great success with horses because he would pick at them. He would peck at them. He wasn't hitting them hard, but he was constantly kind of reminding them to go forward. And some horses are like people. They have short attention spans. You have to keep their focus. So I think there has to be, again, it goes back to educating the regulators, educating riders. And you think about how a horse is supposed to be hit with a whip properly. It's their hind legs are supposed to be on the ground as you're brushing them with the stick or popping them with the stick to make them propel themselves forward. If a horse's front feet are on the ground, all you're doing is slowing them down because they're picking their feet up faster. So it's about educating, about hitting a horse in rhythm, going with their stride, using it as, again, an aid to urge them, not to punish them.
That is some really, really good stuff. I just want to tell you one thing that bothers me watching. This is uneducated, though, and maybe I'm completely wrong about it, but you seem like the right guy to ask. One thing visually that disturbs me when watching a rider really apparently overuse the whip is not giving a horse a chance to respond to the stick and just constantly going back to it. Is that as ugly as I think it is, or is there more to the story?
No, it is. It's a great observation, and it is ugly. And you're asking a horse to do something. Give him an opportunity to respond to the question, right? You don't want to just bang, 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 bang. It confuses a horse. Hey, I'm trying to do what you want me to do, right. And now I'm getting punished for doing what you're trying to do what you want me to do. So, one thing that I believe I had an edge when I came around coming up under a contract and under an old school horseman was you really learn these things about horses. And nowadays it seems like so many young riders are on an accelerated track to where they're small enough, they're athletic, and they can ride a race, but they really don't know how to ride a horse and get that connection. And again, like I said, I admittedly lost it at one point in my career. And a part of my career that I had a lot of success, but I'm not proud of. So I think really you need to take a step back and realize that this is your dance partner as a jockey. The horse is your dance partner, and it's a collaboration, and you don't have to beat it out of a horse. And I'm all for regulations, but again, it has to be administered with common sense and a clarity.
Well, and that can be very tricky when we're getting into talking about stewards' decisions, and it leads me into another area I wasn't planning on talking about, but I'd love to hear your opinion on. Not sure if you've had a chance to take a look at the paper that just came out very recently from the Thoroughbred Idea Foundation about stewarding in America and how different the rules are here. And proposing that the U.S. essentially look at things in the manner that the other jurisdictions around the world do, which is an attempt to worry less about what would have happened with the minor placings, essentially, and worry more about not taking races away from horses who were clearly the best horse in the race. I was just curious if you've put much thought into stewarding in the U.S. versus around the world, if you think they might be onto something with that proposal of a solution, and just how you feel we can try to resolve some of the problems we've seen over the last few years with stewards in the United States.
Well, I think I did read the article, and I think there's some great points brought up. As a former rider, though, I guess I look at things a little bit different, and I certainly understand a lot more from a bettor's standpoint, from a handicapper standpoint, when there's a change in the order of finish and how it affects the wagering public. And I just, from a former rider, though, I think that safety becomes such a huge issue. And I think when a guy does something that puts riders in a dangerous situation, horses in a dangerous situation. Now, I never understood this, and maybe I'm not answering this properly, but two riders are coming down the lane head and head, and they're fighting for it. And a guy drifts out half a path, brushes a horse, and he wins the race by a nose, and they either disqualify him or don't. But then the rider faces sanctions. They'll give that rider 3 days or 5 days. That's a competitive foul. It's not a dangerous foul. Why is the punishment for that the same as if a guy goes into a turn 5 wide and squeezes everybody down to 2 wide, and he's got riders clipping heels, checking, horses jumping on each other, and he gets the same 3 or 5 day suspension? It's like giving the same sentence for jaywalking as it is for assault and battery. And I've never understood the common sense or the thought process and why they can't distinguish between what's a competitive foul and what's a dangerous foul when a guy has more control over a situation. That being said, the inconsistency breeds a huge amount of danger, because at the top level, most riders know exactly where that line is. And if you give me 6 inches, I'm going to take 8. If you give me a foot, I'm going to take a 1.5 feet, right? I mean, that's just the nature of competitive, sports and athletes. So if I know where the line is, I know exactly how far this other rider, and again, at the top level, these guys are so good, and we're talking inches, how much he can take, and he won't go past that line. If I don't know what the line is, I don't know when I've got to protect myself, when I can hold my spot, how much I can put a guy in tight without him overreacting, because he knows I'm not going to go over that line. So when you see a foul on a Wednesday, a horse gets disqualified, rider gets sanctioned, and the same thing happens on Saturday or vice versa, and or from race to race. I saw it in Saratoga this summer in the same card, two different situations. If they take one down, they got to take both down, and they don't. Well, now you're breeding a contempt for the authority of the stewards, because these guys don't know what they're doing. They're inconsistent. And you're also blurring those lines that in a very dangerous game already becomes more dangerous.
I definitely think the key point for me is that dealing with these infractions, the ones that do threaten safety, more severely after the fact. I mean, that to me seems like something that no matter what decision is ultimately made about what's going to happen to the placing of the horses, that dealing with those disciplinary matters in a more appropriate way, where the pickpocketing and jaywalking aren't the same effect. That just makes all the sense in the world. Has it always been that way?
But, again, the culture changes so much. I remember in the early 80s going into the steward's office, and your knees would quake a little bit. And they garnered so much respect. And when they said something, man, you listened. And, we see a lot of things go on at starts of races now. There are a lot of starts where horses get compromised and bothered. And And it's chalked up to, well, it's at the break. Well, as a former rider, I'm here to tell you, there's a lot more that could be done to keep starts straight and guys make better efforts. But if I get wiped out 3 times in a row out of the gate and it's chalked up to, well, it's, out of the starting gate, anything goes, am I going to make an effort to straighten up the next time my horse breaks left or right? And that's compounded by the fact that years ago, you would go to the starting gate on a horse, right, for the race. Not every horse got handled in the gate. There was not an assistant starter for every horse. And you had to actually ask the starter for permission if you were having a hard time with a horse. Sir, can I please get a hand in here? And he may or may not give you a hand with that horse. So you learned as a rider to handle your own horse in the gate, square them up, wait until the last horse was getting loaded before you put them on their feet and balance them out. Young riders don't have to learn that now because their horses get handled. So the only thing an assistant starter can do is make sure that horse's head is straight down the racetrack, looking the right direction. He can't tell if that horse's feet are crossed, if he's off balance behind, if he's got more weight on one leg than the other. And if riders don't know how to, or haven't had to learn how to square their own horse up, of course a horse is going to break more to the left or more to the right because they're a 1,000-pound animal that's not balanced when those doors open. So already you're going to get more ragged starts because of that loss of that just nuance of horsemanship. And then the fact that, well, the stewards say it's okay. So I know that they can do better when you see a horse 4 or 5 strides away from the gate still wiping horses out. And again, too, I'll say it now. I don't have anything to lose about it. Jockeys' rooms used to police each other a lot better. And if a guy did that, well, then they were going to have to face somebody in the room. And unless you wanted to fight every single day in the locker room, you learn to straighten horses up pretty quick.
That's great. That's such a great point about the unique environment of the jocks room. Our mutual friend, Sean Clancy, once described it to me as it's like if you had the Rangers and the Flyers out there on the ice, competing, getting in fights, completely intense competition, and then they go change right next to each other. I always thought that was a fascinating observation that rung very true, and I would imagine does the culture of that should be self-policing. What's the difference today? Is it the first thing that pops into my mind is the sheer amount of money. Is it more than just that leads to a little bit of a different atmosphere? They're still risking their lives every race. I wouldn't surprise me if the patron of the room still tried to have that kind of influence.
Well, yeah, I do think that it's changed a great deal because of the amount of money. Who wants to risk breaking their hand on somebody's head?
Right.
If you're making the kind of money these guys are making, it's, when I started, I've got races with $7,000 purses at Aqueduct. I won a stake when I first started, 15,000 added. I mean, so, when you look at the sheer amount of money, and I just think guys don't want to risk that. I mean, certainly it still happens. Guys get heated. But it used to happen a lot more. And then it didn't have to happen because you knew that was always an imminent possibility. And it's like that old adage, if 2 old dogs start fighting, let them chew on each other for a little while and they'll figure it out and they'll separate. But if you keep on pulling them apart, they're always going to want to get at each other. And the jockeys room culture was definitely a lot tougher in some respects from what I see. I mean, I'm not in the room every day anymore, obviously. And, there were certainly times that you had to step up and say, hey, no, I can't have that. And for me, my thing always was this, the guy took a cheap shot at me. Like if you beat me to a spot or you race rode me, my hat's off to you because then you just outrode me. But if I'm out of horse, I'm empty, and you did something that put me in jeopardy and I couldn't protect myself, well, now I'm angry. Yeah. And guys pretty, much knew, okay, well, I'm not going to take a liberty with this guy because we're going to have to, confront each other, and no one's comfortable with that.
Here's another riding culture observation I want to make, and again, you could tell me if I'm right or wrong about this. I just feel like the level of competition within the rider colony amongst themselves is greatly lesser now. And the example I always use is to go watch the Smarty Jones Belmont and then watch the Belmont from this year. And I'm not trying to take away from Justify exactly, but I'm just saying I can't imagine the group of riders who was riding back then allowing the sort of trip that ended up developing for Justify. And I'm not saying that the old way was better. I mean, in some ways, the idea of, well, I'm going to ride to beat the favorite doesn't make a whole lot of sense, but I swear I saw Jerry Bailey do it a whole bunch of times. I'm just curious.
Well, if the path to the winner's circle is through a particular horse and or rider, don't you have to take your best shot and try to beat that horse? If I don't basically go on a mission to try to figure out a way to beat this horse, I can't win. So in essence, I'm already surrendering before the battle. I mean, I don't understand. I also getting through on the fence. I mean, it's like easy pass now. Years ago, a guy would rather push you through the fence than let you through. I mean, it definitely has changed in that respect. Again, I think it has a lot to do with a lot of guys are a lot friendlier than, I would say that I was friendly with certain guys in the room, but I don't think you could call yourselves like real friends. I mean, Jose Santos and I are good friends now. Jose teases me all the time. He says, I hated riding with you. He goes, you were mean, you were nasty. And yeah, I was. I wanted the same thing you wanted. That is like the way I explain it, and I've explained this to Dylan Davis. So me and his dad, Robbie, we wanted to kill each other all the time. We're friends now, but I said, there's a bag of money laying there at the finish line. Don't you want to get to that bag of money worse than the other guy? I mean, that's how I always looked at it.
I imagine the culture now, the way you get, they're still fighting for the bag of money, but, and maybe this is a little bit of conspiracy theory, but maybe there's certain important people you don't want to make angry at you to get that money down the line, that you might not want to ride as aggressively against certain horses because of that. But clearly, money is still super important, but you don't see the same level, to me, of competition out there. I'm glad it's not my imagination, at least.
Well, no, and I think you bring up a very valid point. There's certain trainers now, like where years ago, a guy had 42 horses at Belmont. That was the maximum allotted. And let's say Woody Stevens' barn was full, and a guy wanted him to take his horse. Says, well, I can't, but this guy's a really good trainer. You might want to go talk to him. And basically it got spread out more. Now, if a guy has 300 horses and I'm going to put his horse in tight, and then the repercussions are he's not going to ride me, I guess it does have to play into a guy's psyche. It has to be an underlying current. Now, that being said, when I rode for Trainer A, I was on his team. And even if I rode a lot of horses for Trainer B, and I could put his horse in a compromising position within the boundaries of the rules, I was going to do that. And the next day when I went to the barn and the guy was mad at me and he said something, I said, listen, when I'm riding for that guy, I'm on his team. When I'm riding for you, I'm on your team. And you're going to get the same exact from me as he got from me yesterday. It's my responsibility to give 110% for whoever I'm riding for on that particular day. And most guys understood that. But again, guys didn't have quite as many horses or the reach that they have now.
I want to ask you about handicapping, also looking at horse flesh, but I'll start off with handicapping. How important, you were hinting at it a little bit before, but we didn't go too deep in the topic. How important was it for you to be able to understand a race on the page in the racing form to ride it effectively?
Oh, absolutely was everything, and particularly before you had race replay centers everywhere. You really relied heavily on the racing form. Mark who's the speed, who's the main speed, who's the secondary speed, who's the true closers, knowing horses' habits, keeping. For me, I was always able to do it by memory, but keeping a book about certain horses' habits, who gets out, who gets in. Who's not brave on the inside, what horses are better on the inside, what riders were going to guard the fence with their lives. Like riding with Chris Antley, if he was in front, you didn't want to be the guy to make the first run at him, because if he came outside of him, he was going to try to pack you out. If you tried to come inside of him, he was going to shut it down. So you always try to let someone else be the first one to make that run, and if you pack them out, then you can cut the corner and get through. So it's a constant preparation. And before race replay centers, especially, the racing form was your most important tool to kind of figure out a pace flow and how races would be run. But later on, as you were able to watch film more and just go to a replay center and plug in, certain horses. Even though it looked like that horse had speed, you'd find, wow, that horse doesn't have real gait speed. His first 3 or 4 steps aren't as fast as my horse. So let's say on the inner track, speed's great at that period of time. That horse is post 3, I'm post 4. Well, it looks like by the first call, he's got more speed than my horse, but my horse got more gait, first step speed, gait speed, I would call it. And I would basically just seize the opportunity, take it away from him, outbreak him, outgun him, get the fence, kind of take him out of his game. So those are the little things, the intangibles that race replays have given riders, more of an opportunity to watch the competition. But the racing form is and has always will be, to me, your most important tool, because you're really going to be able to look at how a race flow should go.
When you're looking at a race as an analyst, are you still looking at that sort of next level of race design, knowing different horses and riders' tendencies to that level, or is it just impossible when you're not in the saddle trying to look at those like in-depth factors?
No, it's ingrained in me. That's kind of how I look at races. I've definitely evolved in how I handicap races. Like it was a little bit difficult for me in the beginning of doing broadcasting and looking at races, because I was always looking at it from just purely a jockey's perspective, how the race going to run and where I would need to be, I would believe, to win the race for myself. Now, as you start handicapping, and I have admittedly got into wagering a bit, and it keeps it kind of exciting. I still use those as tools, but it's changed in so much as that, well, I don't think this horse can lose because of these 3 reasons, but who would be the most likely to finish second, third, and hook things up in exotics, that kind of stuff. So I definitely have gotten a greater appreciation of people that handicap and try to pick winners. I mean, I know how difficult it is, but I still kind of use the tools I did as a rider. And ultimately what it comes down to for me is I go, well, who would I want to ride in this race? Right. And maybe the horse that's going to be favored isn't the one you want to ride, because the way this race shapes up is really kind of going to go against him, and this horse is a vulnerable favorite. I'd rather ride this horse because there's going to be this much speed, and this horse is going to find himself in the perfect spot. So I guess at the end of the day, I still revert back to that because it's my comfort zone.
Makes sense. I really enjoy listening to you talk about horse flesh in both workouts, in the paddock, and out on the track right before the race as well. What advice would you have for a horse player looking to improve his or her ability to judge horses in the flesh?
Well, I think it's just about consistently watching horses warm up. For me, it's something that I, particularly when I was at Belmont or Aqueduct, Saratoga, every single day, I always remember horses. I can't remember birthdays, anniversaries, people's names, but horses I can remember. And wow, that horse looks different today. I don't like what I'm seeing. He looks dry. Look at a horse's coat, and you want to see a certain sheen to it. You want to see a certain, what I call, it's almost like this hydrated look. There's a texture to their coat beyond, people say, well, the horse is all dappled out, but there's more to it than that. There's a horse radiates a certain health when they have, again, I can't really come up with a better way to describe it than they just have a very hydrated look to them. Some people right away think, because a horse is sweating, that's negative. That's not negative if it's a really hot day. That means that horse's coolant system is working properly. If a horse isn't sweating, that's more of a concern on a hot day. The way riders warm horses up are, I think, clues to how they want that horse to run. If a guy leaves the pony and is really warming a horse up aggressively, that means he wants that horse in the bit. He wants that horse to leave the gate with intention. So if you're thinking that horse might have been one of the speeds, but you weren't sure, and you see that rider give him that big warm-up, most likely he's going to be part of the pace. So again, it's fitting the puzzle pieces together and these little subtleties, and those are the things that I look for. Now, when we used to do the Dark Day simulcast shows, Ernie Munich and
Sure.
I at NYRA, we'd watch horses warm up on TV, and I would say this horse is 3 to 5, and that horse cannot win, because especially at lower level tracks, some horses just don't warm up well. They don't loosen up the way you need to see a horse loosen up. And I'm not saying that, they're sore, but they're just not warming up in a fashion that I could ever back with any confidence. And then I'd see some 20-1 shot go by, and then that horse that I can't use the favorite, I'd use that horse. And, me and Ernie, we made some money betting on horses paying $50, $60 because we could put a line through the favorite. So I think sometimes it's knowing who doesn't look good more as opposed to who does look good, because at the higher level, most of the horses are going to look fairly good.
When you're talking about those horses not warming up well, what would be, I'm just trying to think of the vocabulary to describe what that horse is looking like on the TV. I mean, that's unbelievably powerful information. What are you seeing that makes you say, well, not today?
Well, if I'm not seeing the fluidity in their stride, I'm not seeing a rhythm that makes me feel like this horse is really using his stride, extending his stride. And you can see that in a warm-up for sure. Some horses are notoriously bad joggers, so at the jog they're not going to look good. But when a horse picks up his gallop and starts to extend himself, if you're not seeing that rhythm, that fluidity, then that's a big negative to me. If you're not seeing a horse really pick up the bit and get a hold of the rider, these are strong animals. They're, and you got a 115-pound guy on top of his back. If he's not pulling that guy out of the tack, I find that a negative. I want to see an energy level. I want to see a focus. Sometimes it's just as simple, and this is more nuanced, but again, I've been around horses now my whole life, a certain look in a horse's eye. A horse's eye will tell you so much. You want a clear eye, but a very laser-like focus from that eye. You see a horse sometimes, it's almost like the light's on, but nobody's home. That's a huge negative. They're not using their energy properly.
If you could only see a horse either working out in the morning before a race, in the paddock before a race, or going to the gate for the race, I presume for you there's the most signal right when they're going to the gate?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's why I have so much respect for like Maggie Wolfendale and how she's able to pick out and spot certain things in the paddock, because for me, I think it's easier when you see them on the track. Their energy level really amps up, and you definitely get a better idea. So I have so much respect, and I can't compliment the job that she does, and people like her that can pick that stuff out in the paddock better than I can. I really, really think seeing them on the track, for me, is what helps.
Your workout analysis that I've watched over the years is also excellent. When you're evaluating workouts, how important is the time of the workout to you?
I'm really not a time guy. It's probably the most important thing that I look at. In a perfect world, if you see a horse just moving the way you want to see a horse move and doing everything right, switching leads right on cue, great enthusiasm, and doesn't look like he's doing a lot, but then the time is fast, as well, that's the perfect storm. That's when you go, wow, this horse is not only doing things properly, using himself properly, but it comes easy to him. And that's when you pick out the real, upper level horses that are stakes bound, particularly in first time starters. You watch a horse work and he looks like he's going slow, but he actually went fast. That's when you find your hidden gems or your diamonds in the rough.
Great. What is a lesson that horsemen could learn from horse players and handicappers, or vice versa?
Well, I think horsemen in general tend to fool themselves a bit. Like you work with a horse every day, and your tendency is always going to want to be to give the horse the benefit of the doubt. He's better than this. I know that he can do more. I think horse players are a lot more practical in assessing a horse's abilities and saying, well, they got this horse in for 50. He's really worth 35. Where a horseman's almost too close to the horse, so maybe he loses some of his objectivity. So I think, I think Andy Serling's really good at this, so that he can pick out, where a horse really belongs, and he's not afraid to voice that opinion. And I think people would actually give their horses a better competitive chance if they listened to horse players in general, because I think they have a truer assessment of where that horse's class level is.
Makes sense. What about the flip side of that question? When you talk to horse players, what's something you hear us consistently miss that a horseman would know?
Well, I think just not having the ability to be close to those horses and see different subtle changes. I think that if I had to say one thing, I think people really need to, and this isn't from a trainer's perspective, but from a rider's perspective, really kind of differentiate between what's a bad ride and what's an unlucky ride. Because I hear so many times riders get blamed, for a ride, and I go, well, yeah, okay, he was saving ground, he got locked in, but would you really rather have him 4 or 5 wide, particularly on the turf? Most of the time things work out. You find a gap or you find live cover, a horse to follow through a spot. I liken it to a fullback going through the line and the halfback following his wake. So a guy can do everything right and it just doesn't break right. That's not a bad ride. That's an unlucky ride. A bad ride to me is when it's obvious a guy hasn't prepared. And it's always apparent to me when a guy hasn't prepared, when he, locks himself into a position. Jerry Bailey was great because he always had outs. He never put himself in one position if he can give himself 3 options. And that's what your best riders do. So more from, I think horsemen need to keep their objectivity when it comes to a horse's abilities, assessing a horse's abilities. And I think horse players have to keep their objectivity in how they look at a race and not be so swayed by, who they bet on or what their opinion was, because as we know, you can be really good at this and still your opinion can be bad on a particular day.
Yeah, or just be unlucky, like you were saying. I think that having that objectivity and trying to look at the decisions along the way as opposed to just judging everything based on the outcome, that seems like very good advice for no matter which part of the business you're in. We talked about your connection to baseball, being a baseball fan, and baseball leading to, in a funny way, to your being involved in racing. Here's a baseball-like question. Obviously, every baseball fan feels entitled to go and criticize the center fielder and talk very critically about ball players. How, as racing fans, should we balance our right to be critical with the fact that jockeys, unlike ball players, are out there risking their lives every day? Does it make some of the criticism unfair, or are we still entitled to be fans and to say the things that fans say?
Well, no, I think everybody has a right to be critical, and there are times then that criticism is warranted, and guys aren't perfect. Now, as a former rider, and it's easy for me to say now, it's coming on 9 years since I rode. You're sensitive. I know I was. I could be kind of prickly when it came to that, and if I felt like a guy criticized me unfairly, I wasn't happy about it. I certainly would voice it, and looking back on it, I probably wasn't right half the time. I'd say some of the times I was, but sometimes, hey, you know what? It comes with the territory. You're in a public domain. You're performing in public, and sometimes you're going to make mistakes. As you grow and mature, you learn to handle that better. But I think you got to factor in a lot of things that why riders are probably sensitive in general to criticism. Most of us are starving all the time. I was living on 700 calories a day when I rode for 29 years. You're going to be a bit hangry or cranky, if you will. And then the level of competition. So it's a performance based endeavor. If you're not winning, your opportunities are going to diminish. So you constantly feel the pressure of that. It is dangerous. Most guys, everybody's been hurt at one time or another. So, you have that pressure as well. And looking back on it, I wish I would have been able to acknowledge more when I wasn't riding well and go, you know what, I'm just riding bad. I got to take a step back, think it through, breathe, relax instead of pressing. But it's hard when you're in the midst of it. And I guess it's harder to take criticism when the majority of people, and I'm not saying this is right. I think this is actually a shortcoming. It was a shortcoming of mine. And maybe I shouldn't speak for anybody else that guy never rode a horse. That's what I used to think. What does he know? But at the end of the day, that doesn't mean a guy can't watch a race and see when you made a mistake. I guess too, I was so hard on myself that there was a day once at Aqueduct, I had won 4, I won the stake. In the last race, I'm locked and loaded on the inside. I'm going to win 5, and I'm, this is easy, right? And Jockey 101, when the two horses in front of you are dead and you've got guys like Cordero or George Velasquez on the outside of them, you don't try to go inside of those guys because they're going to see you and they're going to close the door. They're going to push those horses in, and those riders can't hold their line because they're out of horse. And I guess because I was anticipating winning 5, I'm just going to blew through here at the 5/16 pole. And, of course, I believe it was Angel saw, pushed the guy over. I hit the fence, dropped back 5 lengths, came flying, beat a nose. Now, I totally screwed it up. Instead of being able to look at that and go, well, I rode good all day, 4, I made a mistake, I couldn't enjoy the 4 I won. I went home that night. I couldn't eat. I couldn't sleep. And in my mind, you see, I'm exposed. I'm not a good rider because of the one mistake I made that day. There's a balance there. Yes, you have to be critical of yourself. You have to acknowledge mistakes, but you can't do it to a point where it just completely paralyzes you. And I would tend to do that when I rode because, again, I never wanted to be the mutt.
Yeah, it gets back to that competitive spirit for sure. You talk about the challenges of riding and the struggles with weight that so many riders face. In 2018, is it time that we took a look at the scale of weights and thought about raising it, or is it just kind of is what it is at this point?
Well, it's going to sound funny, but I think it is what it is. They're definitely higher than it used to be. You see guys tacking 117, 118. When I came around, the journeyman did 14. That was extremely heavy.
Wow.
If Apprentice couldn't do 106, 107, he was considered heavy. And I think what you're going to do is you're always going to open the door for guys that, let's say, can't do 18, but now you raised it to 22. You're always going to have a group of people that are going to be torturing themselves to get under that certain requirement. So I think it's a problem that there's no answer to it. I think we're probably at a threshold that I think is safe and fair for the horses. I don't think you want to see horses carrying, particularly in dirt racing. I think it's a little different in turf racing, 130, 135, 133, whatever it may be on a consistent basis. I think, it's a specialized ability, a skill to be a rider. It's not for everybody. There's certain people that just physically aren't going to be able to do it. I mean, I like to joke that I was the center on the jockey basketball team. I'm a tall guy. I was able to tack 114 through the last 10 or 12 years of my career, but I also had a show of discipline and a strictness that most people aren't able to maintain over a long period of time. I'm 145 now, and people look at me and say, wow, you look like you could still ride. But no, I'm actually over 30 pounds over my riding weight. So, it's not for everybody.
Jeez.
And there's a certain cutoff, and I think it is what it is at this point.
When you think of it in weight percentage terms, that's just insane. I mean, I've seen you recently. You do look, skinny. And 30 pounds, I mean, that's just insane, that the difference between that and riding weight. So now, especially, I was going to ask you this anyway, but especially knowing that, how is it that you got interested in cooking even back in your riding days? Was this just another way of being really hard on yourself?
Well, no, my grandfather was a chef and a restaurateur, and growing up, I really have great memories of being in the kitchen with him, and there's a certain comfort, the family thing, and then when I went to the racetrack, and I was making $90 a week and living on the backstretch, I could make better food in my room on a hot plate, even though you weren't supposed to cook, at the track. For less money. So I've always had an interest in that. And then, you have children. My wife, Carmela, is a great cook. She would actually feed the kids before I got home from the races if they were having pot roast or meatloaf or lasagna, because I couldn't eat like that.
Right.
And she didn't want me to have to suffer through everybody else enjoying that kind of food. So I would get home and grill 4 or 5 ounces of chicken or fish, make a salad with raw beans, lentils, raw, so you wouldn't cook any of the nutrients out, weigh everything out, measure everything out, little squeeze of lemon. And, that's the way I had to live. And my one luxury after dinner, I would take 12 M&Ms and put them in a Dixie cup and watch TV and make those 12 M&Ms last for an hour.
Oh, my God.
It's a crazy way to live, but I would do it all over again if I could. I mean, I didn't quit by choice. I I had to because physically I just was beat up. But it was a wonderful, wonderful career, and it gave me, great things. I live in the Hudson Valley. I always wanted to live here. I have horses. It's just racing has given me everything. Horses have given me everything, I should say.
That's fantastic. I love to hear it, and this has been such a pleasurable hour. I will let you go, but I could keep you here as long as you'd stay asking questions. What an amazing perspective, an amazing life story, and we've barely scratched the surface. I will make you suffer through one more question, though, and I'll ask it like this. Is it safe to assume we may be seeing and or hearing you soon on the other side of a microphone?
Yeah, I would think so for sure. It's an odd time of the year. Not too many big races between now and the end of the year other than the opening of Santa Anita. Unfortunately, XBTV went in a different direction, so I'm not with them any longer. But have had a lot of conversations with people about coming back to do certain things. A little premature to
Sure.
announce anything concrete. And also working on a project that I think will be pretty interesting. So it won't be long. I'm sure I will be on the other side of the mic again.
I love it, and I can't wait to have you back to talk about it when you're ready to do that. Richard Migliore, thank you so much for your time today.
No, thank you. It was great talking with you.
And that will do it for this episode of the DRF Players podcast. Thanks again to Richard Migliore. Thanks to JK, even though he wasn't here. He will be back later in the week, as will I. Thanks most of all to all of you for listening. I'm Peter Thomas Fornatale. May you win all your photos.